Okay, folks, hello. Hope you can hear me okay. I'm Nancy Giebert, and it's an honor and privilege for me to be the Chief Program Officer for CancerControl Alberta. And it's a privilege for me to test out our Cancer Leadership TED Talks, and this is our first go around, so I will welcome any feedback or suggestions you have for future talks. We're hoping to have these at least 2 to 3 times a year. And again, your feedback would be greatly appreciated. One of the reasons why I started to think about TED Talks for cancer leadership is we need to ensure that we are building capacity for our future leaders within cancer control. And we've got some phenomenal people at the front lines and in various positions that may not have formal leadership positions. And how do we build a sustainable leadership for cancer control for now and in the future? We also have, I believe, an obligation to support our current leadership and to ensure that where possible, we give the tools in the toolbox to support their leadership. And again, that became very evident to me with our recent Gallup poll. And the feedback, I think, we as managers and leaders with cancer control got from our staff, frontline staff, our physicians, and even personally my management direct reports on what we need to do to build a healthy workplace and a sustainable and workplace for cancer control, both at all the sites. I'm pleased that we've got many sites here today, and we will have some times for questions. It will not take the full hour, but again, we really appreciate your attendance today. So it's my pleasure to introduce our first TED Talk speaker, Feisal Keshavjee. So Feisal, I think you're coming back home because Feisal started his leadership journey, particularly in healthcare here at the Foothills. And I've got to know Feisal through our involvement in the Canadian College of Health Leaders, his involvement with GE Health, and also other numerous initiatives that he has either project managed or led as a consultant or as an employee in the health system or as an employee with GE. Feisal is one of these type of individuals that speaks from the heart, speaks from experience, and probably really values the importance of what needs to happen to invest in staff around leadership. And he personally, I think, experienced this with his GE Health experience, where GE does an extreme investment. But also he took his own personal journey and has been a mentor and a support to many people across Alberta and nationally and internationally. I'm not going to read his bio because it is available to you when we sent out the announcement. But it's an honor and privilege for me to have Feisal with us here today. And I'd remiss to also thank Celine Snell, who basically orchestrated the room bookings and the logistics. So thanks, Celine. And also to Ron and all the other support to get the logistics. So I'm going to turn it over to Feisal, and thank you and welcome and our inaugural TED Talk.
Thank you. Thanks, Nancy. I told my daughter I was doing a TED Talk, and she said, "Oh my God, I'm going to tell all my friends, and we'll watch it on YouTube." So, no, but thank you. It's great to be here. You know, I've always admired Nancy as an amazing leader, so to be asked to give a leadership talk by Nancy is at one time very flattering, and then at the same time brings on a sudden acute onset of imposter syndrome when you get asked by Nancy. And, you know, speaking of which, I'll remember Nancy mentioned the college, and I'll talk about it later in my talk, but when I came back from New Zealand, I was asked by the Canadian College of Health Leaders local chapter to give a talk on comparing the New Zealand, Australian, and Canadian healthcare systems, because I worked in both while I was there. And some of you might not know, but there was a VP at the time, and I know Marg's in the audience here, so Joan McGregor. And just as I was about to get up and talk, she said, don't worry, your secret's safe with me. Nobody knows you for the fraud that you are. Just as I was about to talk. And I said, what do you mean? She said, you could have been in jail for the last 4 years and nobody would have known. We just know you weren't around. So I assure you I wasn't in jail ever. Nancy, thank you for that kind introduction. You reminded me that, I grew up here, and in fact, I started my healthcare experience here. So I was a dietary aide from the age of 17. And so I've spent a lot of time on this site. So I was one of you, and I loved working here at the site. And if you can see back in the day, when we first regionalized, we split things off in terms of acute care and long-term care or community care. And it was a great time back then. So somebody gave me my old business card a few weeks ago and said, I don't think I need this anymore, but I thought you might be interested in it. So I thought it would be great. I'll bring it back. I'll put it in my talk. And as Nancy mentioned, and in the bio, one of my claims to fame or infamy was working on the decommissioning of the general hospital. And, it was an interesting time. And, one of your colleagues, Mark Selman, and I worked very closely together, during that time. And, but what that was a really interesting, turning point in my career, because when you do a project like that, I know a lot of you are involved in the major capital project for cancer that's coming up. While it was a very sad day to see these beautiful buildings go down, it did afford me a new type of career, and one that challenged my leadership in there. So I was offered a role after this project to move to New Zealand to do similar healthcare restructuring projects with Ernst & Young. And it was a tough decision to make. And I consulted a lot of people, as you do. And I finally thought this was the right decision to make. And so I put my resignation in. And the then CEO of the Calgary Regional Health Authority, as it was called back then, phoned me up and said, I want to take you out for dinner. And I thought, oh, great. This is a CEO who's going to take me out for dinner and tell me this is the great part of my leadership journey, and one day I'll come back and be a CEO. And we sat down, and as soon as the server gave us our menus and walked away, he said, you are making the biggest mistake of your life. And I thought, oh my God, what have I done? Then he said, yeah, we had you earmarked for a senior position in long-term care. And I thought, nursing homes, New Zealand, I'm glad I made the decision I did. But it did make me think. I was taking a fork. I was at a fork in the road, and I was taking a certain path, and I thought I got to get the most out of this. And what the advice that was given to me at the time was saying, treat this like part of your education, like an MBA. You're going to develop great networks, and you're going to learn a lot. So just take from those learnings. And so hopefully I'll be able to impart some of that knowledge today. So as Nancy mentioned, I've been blessed to be part of numerous great organizations here and abroad, EY, GE, where I learned a lot about leadership traits. And when you start thinking about leadership traits, I call them quotients. And the reason why I call them quotients is because quotients are a number. You can attach a number to some of these things because, as we know in healthcare, if it doesn't get measured, it doesn't get managed. So we've always thought of leadership as, in the last 10 years as, high IQ, high EQ leaders. And that's certainly the case. You've got the left brain, right brain kind of people there. But, what I've been kind of exposed to in my travels is that there's probably other traits that we should be measuring and we should be managing as well. And so, and it's kind of how I've defined leadership. And so, being with a company like GE, I had a good fortune of getting a lot of leadership training. As Nancy said, they invest about $1 billion a year in leadership training or in training for their staff. And they have a leadership institute just outside New York, a place called Crotonville. And, when you go there, you get immersed, and they have this 3-week course. And what's really cool is, you see these textbooks, and you get to hear the actual authors of them, and they're talking about it. And we were very fortunate enough to get these guys who wrote this book called Leadership Lessons from West Point. So most of you know that West Point is kind of like the Harvard of military colleges. And so they said something really interesting, and it's kind of changed my whole definition of leadership. And they said, you know, when you look at 95 to 98% of leadership training, it's competency-based. It teaches us to be a better listener, a better goal setter, all of those things. He said, you know, you work on competencies. Whereas in the military, they see leadership as values-based because they've got to convince somebody to go over that hill and get shot at. And it's a very different type of leadership. And they said, the leader that we want is, you want to be the kind of leader that people want to follow. And so that always stuck with me, saying, you know, like, it's great to have these competencies, but if you want to be the kind of leader that people want to follow, there are other leadership traits that you have to make sure that you've mastered. So this type of values-based leader is important because it's something that, you know, he said followers pick their leaders. It's instinctive. It's something that's instantaneous, and it changes all the time. And so this whole concept of trust and all of these other traits come in. So today we're going to cover 8. I've already mentioned a couple, so why don't we get into them right away, and then I'll leave it open for questions. There's time for questions, right? Okay. We'll leave it open for questions. So the first one, IQ. You know, the first quotient is IQ. It's God-given. You can't really change it. It measures the ability to learn. And it's easy to measure. The test for IQ has been around since 1912. From a leadership point of view, it's your ticket to entry. Everybody here, I imagine, has a very high IQ, and it's one of those things that you have, and you wouldn't be a leader of any sort if you didn't possess this. The interesting thing about IQ, as a predictor of leadership success, it's anywhere from 1 to 20%, and the average in the literature is about 6%. So it's not a huge predictor of leadership success. Whereas when we start looking at EQ, as they call it, it's not God-given. It can be learned. It measures your ability to use emotions or logic when needed. If IQ is what gets you through school, this is what gets you through life, if you want to look at it that way. It's correlated with decreased occupational stress, decreased turnover, increased decision-making, better team performance. And as a predictor of leadership success, 27 to 45%. So it's pretty high in terms of, if you want to, when you start hearing about leaders, these are the traits that come out the most. And so if you want to, there are EQ tests out there, and you just need to go to one. I put one up here if anybody is interested in taking a minute to read this. The website for it is called arealme.com, arealme.com, to try it out. So let's take 30 seconds. So we can't see the other sites, but the one in your, how many think the first one? Second one? A few hands, okay. Third one? Okay. Fourth one? Okay. So there's no real right or wrong answer. I think the EQ quotient goes up as you go down the list. I'll give you a caveat about that, about the arealme.com. I did this EQ test and I scored pretty good, and I thought, oh, that's great. But you can also do an IQ test, and I can assure you I don't have an IQ of 160. So you got to take that test with a grain of salt. It's a lot of fun though. But the interesting thing about EQ is, so, one of the best interview questions I learned relating to EQ is asking someone, if we were to ask 3 people who worked closely with you over the past year, what would they say you need to work on? And the reason that's an interesting test is one of the measures of EQ is self-awareness. So if this person makes it through your filter and then you go and ask their references the same question, what's the match? And that kind of gives you a great indication of their EQ level, or one measure. And so those have been really the two. When you kind of talk about a good leader, they have good emotional intelligence, but there are a few others. The one that has been surfacing a lot in management literature is the one about getting results and getting stuff done, right? So we call this XQ, or execution quotient. So if you think of the body, IQ's the head, EQ's the heart, XQ's the hands, and it's all about. And why results are important is it's a measure of credibility for the leader. The consistency of getting results is something that is seen as a credibility currency for leadership. And really, there are three kind of measures, or if we can stick with the term of quotients that I would put forward. One is, we've always heard that about 10% of all leaders are effective leaders, and where does that 10 or 12% number come from? Well, there's a thing called the say-do ratio, and the say-do ratio is 50% of leaders actually say they're going to do something. 50% of those 50% actually do it, and 50% of those 50% do it consistently. So if you've got 50% of 50% of 50%, you've got about 12.5%, and that's kind of where it's very difficult to get that type of leader that consistently comes through with results. The other one that's also interesting is line of sight, and I think this is important when we in healthcare, when we look at it. When you think about what are you doing, and is 60% of your time spent doing the your top five objectives for the year or for a certain time period, and are those top five objectives your manager or your boss's top five objectives? So how is their line of sight of what the organization's goals are and how it comes down the various levels of hierarchy? Difficult in healthcare because there's different lines of hierarchy, but it's interesting. Is everybody going in the same direction? And so, one of the tests is, we call it the calendar test. Looking at your calendar to say, what am I spending my big chunks of my time on? And the last one, and it's tough, is resource management. And this one is 0. The quotient here is 0%. Are you? And I know you're all going to laugh at this one, but are you keeping within budget? And time and money, right? So is your variance 0%? Are you trying to come in? And it's not, we know budgets are impossible, but when you promise something in 6 weeks, are you delivering in 6 weeks? Are you kind of your personal variance in resource allocation? And then, of course, in the world of healthcare, time is probably the most valuable resource. Are you keeping that? Are you keeping that at a zero variance? So that's execution quotient. Now we go to the fun one. DQ. I couldn't resist. I had to put that on. Development quotient. Though that makes me want to have an ice cream, but yeah. So when I think of the places that I gave 110%, is the places where I felt most engaged. And the places where I felt most engaged are the places where somebody was concerned about my personal well-being. And there's some fascinating research on this, on engagement. I know you've handed some books out. There's another book called Well-Being. And what it is, it's a compilation of all the data that Gallup, you heard of Gallup polls? Gallup collected their data for 60 years, and they put it in this book called Well-Being. And they talk about career well-being, physical well-being, spiritual well-being. And one of the ones about career well-being is engagement. So there's a lot of study that they did in engagement. And so the numbers go like this, and they're fascinating. If your boss basically neglects you and say, Nancy's a great worker, I'm just going to leave her alone and let her do her thing, there is a 44% chance that you will be disengaged at work. Nobody pays attention to you. If somebody pays attention to you, but they focus on the negative, like constructive criticism or micromanaging, it's a bit better, there's a 22% chance you're going to be disengaged at work. But if you are allowed to play to your strengths and do what you want to do what you love doing at work, there's only a 1% chance that you'll be disengaged at work. So it's there's some fascinating research on this. And people who you hear people who say I have the best job in the world. Those are the people who have fun at work. And people who describe their jobs as fun or the best job in the world are the ones that are very actively engaged and are allowed to play. They're doing work that they consider playing to their strengths. And some other data that came around this is if you're disengaged, whether you're part of the 44% or it's 22% or 1% even, there's twice the likelihood you'll be depressed. So disengagement at work is a very powerful tool. And this is a fundamental skill for leaders. How do you engage your workforce? So when you think about what's the quotient associated with this is 5 to 15%. Are you spending 5 to 15% developing your staff? And that's a lot. It's anywhere from 2 to 6 hours a week. So when you think about your last few days this week, did you spend more than an hour developing staff? And developing staff is not just a one-on-one. It's not telling them what to do. It's asking open-ended questions. It's actively working on their needs. And there are many coaching models out there. The one I like to use is, and I've been doing a lot of coaching for a number of years, and I've just kind of come up on this one in the last 6 months to a year, and it's fascinating. It's a simple acronym: GROW. Goals, reality, options, and will. So what are the goals that you want for this coaching session? What will success look like? What would make this a good session? What would make this a great session? Reality is, what's the current reality that you're facing today? What are the issues? You should spend probably most of your time here. What's the current state? Who are the characters involved? Options are, what are your options that that you've thought of? And this is where you ask them to be completely off the wall, because that's where some of the greatest discoveries are made. And the reason why I like this model is because the last one, will. What will you do? What is your immediate action tomorrow that's going to get this goal achieved? And the best question that I learned from this one is, you ask someone on a scale of 1 to 10, how committed are you to getting this done? If they don't give you a 10, you say, why isn't this a 10? And so it's very action oriented. So developing staff is, and Nancy talked about it at the beginning in the introduction. They are the future. It is a very, very important skill as a leader. I know as you moved up in GE, they basically, even I can't speak for the current one, but the last chairman and CEO of GE spent 30% of his time developing his staff or developing his direct reports. So it's something that is vitally important. This one I'm going to gloss over because this is the last group I need to convince about the benefits of the physical quotient, or PQ. You know it, when I talk to other groups and I'm coaching other people, I refer to the acronym of NEWS: nutrition, exercise, water, and sleep. As you know all too well, these are very, very important. There's some fascinating research that's coming out around sleep. There was one study done where they gave a group a complex problem to solve for 8 hours and wanted to see how creative their answers were. And they gave another group the same problem, but they only had 2 hours to do it. Then they had to go home and sleep and come back the next day and work on it for 6 hours. So both groups had 8 hours to do it. The group that slept on it came up consistently by a long shot with the more creative answers, which basically led the researchers to conclude that we learn while we sleep. So we shouldn't be denying ourselves that much sleep. So, and I know you guys know this, so I'm just going to move on from this point. Organization quotient, OQ. This is a huge, AHS is a huge organization. I don't need to tell you that. Largest employer in Alberta, 7th largest in the country, all of that kind of stuff. But it's like the healthcare system. People need a navigator. People need to know all the things that are available. And as a leader, this is important for your staff. You are able to remove barriers. You're able to enable interactions. And as a leader, the quotient here I will give you is 15 minutes. It doesn't seem like a lot, but if, again, we're going back to that consistency. If you give 15 minutes, and it could be on a Sunday night writing a newsletter, or Monday morning, I know the country manager of GE Canada has a call 8 o'clock to 8:15 every Monday morning that basically says, here's what's happening in the organization. So nothing about their particular unit, but here's what's happening in the organization. Because as a leader, you're privy to a lot of information that's kind of above you, at your level, below you, probably in different areas of the organization. And that 15 minutes just grounds everybody, kind of saying, here, okay, that's great information, that's great sharing, it's that sense of community. And it happens at all levels. In my kids' school, the principal sends out a note to the parents and the teachers on Sunday night. You can set your watch to it at 8 o'clock Sunday evening, saying the week ahead. And it's great because he spends the first couple of lines and it's all in bullet form, congratulating the staff or students on what happened in the previous week. If somebody won a tournament or if somebody got some award. Then he talks about what's going to happen for the next week. And then he talks about, here's what to look forward to in the coming weeks ahead. And so I told him about it in passing. I said, hey, that's great. It's nice to know because, you never know when kids have they don't tell you when there's parent-teacher interview. You have to figure this out yourself, so because they don't want you there. But he said you wouldn't believe how galvanizing it was, or how, what a team-building tool that was for amongst the teachers. He said they just loved having, because now what they do, they feel connected to the greater school community. So when they see a student who won an award and who's in junior high, and they'll be able to go up to them and congratulate them. My former colleague, who's the head of GE, she has a call 8 o'clock Monday morning, and one of the managers that lives in Vancouver sets his alarm Monday morning to be like it's 5 a.m. for him. But it's a call, he said, it's a meeting I never miss because I learned so much about what's happening in the organization for that week that it helps me connect with my colleagues in other areas. So I know they're working on this and I know that's going on. And he said, even though it's only 15 or 20 minutes, and he says, I go back to sleep after, but I never miss that call. So, is there an ability to spend 15 minutes just kind of informing your team about what's happening in the greater organization? The next one is team quotient. And the important thing here is even fire ants won't eat McDonald's French fries. They just make words with them. As we all know, healthcare is a team sport, as it should be. And we've all heard that concept of team dynamics of forming, norming, storming, and performing. And if you ever want to see a movie that depicts that, it's called Remember the Titans. It's an amazing movie, Denzel Washington. The interesting thing that a lot of people don't know is that only 14% of teams ever make it to the performing level. So if you think of committees that you sit on, and I'm sure there's a lot of you that sit on at least 7. So if you're on 7 committees, only one of them is truly performing statistically, if you look at that. And when you look at, when they did this research, so the guy who came up with this concept of forming, storming, norming, and performing actually went back and did a research 30 years later to say, why is it only 14%? And they found 3 very interesting things. Number one is the teams that reached the performing stage, the leader was a flexible leader. was able to adapt their style to the situation or to the current environment. And so the flexibility in the leadership style was number one. Number two, clarity. At any given point, the teams that performed were the teams that knew exactly what was expected of them. And you'd be surprised, a lot of teams just don't know that. As you know, you sit on committees get formed. I think everybody, you know, and sometimes everybody has a different idea of what it is they're supposed to achieve. So that clarity is very important. And the number three one was this bias for action, and they call it artful. So finishing every meeting with an action, somebody who's responsible, timing, who's going to follow up, and learning. And this was an important one, the learning concept. Because at the end of every meeting, the teams that performed were the ones that said, what did we learn from this meeting? What went well, and what could we do that next time to make it better? And so that's, you know, and you can tell when you're finished a meeting with one of these master black belt Six Sigma people, because they'll ask you that. They'll say, so give me 3 things that went well in that meeting and 3 things I can do better for next time. And it throws you off, but it actually is a really good learning tool, and it is an improvement tool. So as you know, you guys do a lot of teamwork, committee work. Performance is a performing team is not as common as you'd think, but there are a lot of ways to make it common. And the last quotient, I call it the networking quotient, or NQ. I've never seen so many cool people in one picture together. I don't know if this is probably not an AHS meeting, but that guy's got a sporting a cool beard, isn't he? Yeah, this one's, I saved this one for last. So, you know, I mentioned we talked about New Zealand, and let me tell you how New Zealand came about. When I was in graduate school, I was approached by the dean at the time and said, hey, there's an alumni function. We'd like you to attend. And I thought, no, I'm not going to do it. You know, I had like 3 days of beard growth, and I'm like, forget it. And he said, no, it's important that, you know, we get students to come out. And I thought, okay, fine, I'll go out. And there you met some alumni, and there's, you know, I met a guy that worked, who was alumni of our program that worked at Ernst & Young in Chicago. And it was great. Meeting happened. And it was over. We all kind of went on with our lives. I came back to Calgary, was involved, did the Calgary General project. And as you know, with big projects like this, which I'm sure you'll have, people come from all over the world to see how did you guys do it. And there was this team that came from New Zealand and wanted to know how we did our program moves and our restructuring, because they were not closing one hospital, they were closing 3 hospitals and building one big monolithic hospital. And so they really were quite impressed with, you know, how we merged 2 cardiac surgery programs, as you know, and all of the things that we did. And so they went back to New Zealand with all that information, and they were sitting down with their consultants, and guess which firm they had? Ernst & Young. And guess who had relocated from the Chicago office to the New Zealand office for a life change. And he says, I've met this guy before. And they said, well, if you could get him over here, we'll give you a 3-year contract for our restructuring. And so I didn't know that at the time when they were recruiting me, but yeah, that's what started a life journey. So, you know, people think that networking is for extroverts. It certainly isn't. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got is that, you know, you are the CEO of You Inc., right? Nobody else is going to be that. And so think of networking as environmental scanning. You're going out there, you're finding out what's important. You're, you're getting different, fresh perspectives, new thinking, all of that kind of stuff. And so it's important that, you know, you take the CEO role of You Inc. very seriously. And like all good CEOs, CEO of Apple, Suncor, AHS, they all have a board of directors. And so here's a concept I'll leave you with, is developing your own personal board of directors. Anybody that I coach I'll only coach them if they do this. And it's interesting. Think of having 2 or 3 people above you, at your level and below you, inside the organization that you work in and outside. That's a lot of people. But remember, a good board has different skill sets. So you might have somebody that you admire in the clinical realm, somebody that's got good financial acumen, somebody that's got good people management acumen. You can see how you can find people like that. And it's important to frequently meet with your board. And it doesn't have to be 5 times a year or 10 times a year, but once or twice a year just to touch base. A lot of people ask, why do you have somebody below? And what's amazing and I've actually been in the room when many careers have been derailed because somebody was ready for a move up, but because they didn't do that succession planning, they hadn't developed people below them. They'd say, well, Bill's ready for a move up, but you know what? He'll leave a huge hole, so we'll just keep him where he is. And it's sad to say, but it's important. And the other benefit of having people below you, it's the first time ever that we've got 4 generations working in the same workforce. There's a lot to learn from people of different generations. And so, I mean, any of you who want to know how to program your phone, you go to a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old and it's done, right? So it's important that you have that type of, people at all levels. And this personal board of directors has been very successful for me personally, and a lot of people have really benefited from it. So I would encourage you to do that. I've got a great template. I'll share it with Nancy if anybody's interested to give out. So I'm going to stop there because I know we're close to the end. I'm still on my journey. I'm not done yet. But if I think leadership is something that you never say, okay, I'm a leader, I'm at this position, so therefore I must be a good leader. You're never done, and it's always a constantly developing thing. So I would, the fact that you guys are here is already a step forward. So I'll leave it at that, Nancy. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you.